It had been so long, it was doubtful if Philip Peters even recognized Theodore Coneys as he fought for his life in his Denver home. He had hosted this stranger 4 decades earlier to play mandolin and have dinner on several occasions. Unfortunately, life didn't turn out well for that young man, and by a tragic twist of fate, they would meet under the most unusual set of circumstances. Most people are more familiar with the Marvel superhero, Spider-Man, that was introduced to the world in 1962. This is the story of the original Spider-Man, a man named Theodore Edward Coneys, who was living in a place people thought only a spider could survive. Theodore Coneys was born in Petersburg, Illinois in 1882. His father died a few years later in 1888, so his mother decided to move first to Wisconsin and then later to Denver, Colorado. From a young age, Theodore suffered from poor health and a frail condition that was so bad the doctors said they did not expect him to see his 18th birthday or make it to the 20th century. For this reason, he didn't even finish high school or plan much for the future. Because of this frail condition, he was picked on at school, and since he couldn't play sports, his mom steered him more into music, and she also didn't want him to get a job. So Theodore was 17 when he first met Philip Peters, who was around 30 at that time, and had just purchased his West Moncrief house with his wife Helen. They had met through the West Moncrief Mandolin Club, where he and his wife gave lessons and played music in their home. Over some of these dinners, Theodore told them how he resented the way he was treated by others for his condition. He said people would laugh at him, and he knows why they don't want to be with him. He said someday he wanted to live in a cave or somewhere where he doesn't have to hear it. In fact, Theodore was probably even envious of the Peters for their success and good health. So a few years later, just after the McKinley assassination, Philip was leaving his work at the Denver and Rio Grande Railway office. He had been moving up the ranks there as an auditor when he stumbled upon the shabby and slender Theodore during a snowstorm. Theodore told him of his family's misfortunes. His mother had sold her property in Illinois to some men who convinced her to invest it in a mine. They never saw those men or that money again. Philip naturally felt bad for Theodore, so he invited him over for dinner. In his home, Theodore saw Philip's mandolin on the piano and told him he didn't play anymore because he didn't like to see crowds of happy people. He considered leaving town, but he didn't want to leave his mother. But at least his advertising business he started with a co-worker had showed some signs of promise. His only problem was that he couldn't tell people unpleasant news. In fact, he couldn't even swat a fly if he had to. He said he was only brave when he knew how to hate, and he didn't know whom to hate. The last time Philip saw Theodore was about 9 years later, just after the Titanic sunk in the spring of 1912. Theodore told him how his mother had just died, and he was going to keep on going living, but wasn't sure what to do. Philip didn't see him again for nearly 30 years, but Theodore had plenty more stories. He moved on from Denver and lived most of the next 30 years as a hobo. This time period also included the Great Depression, which no doubt must have been very hard. At one point, he attempted to get in the army during World War I, but was laughed off by the recruiter. Another time, he fell from a train in central Kansas, but managed to survive. He lived under a bridge in California and other flop houses. He briefly had a comeback in Tonawanda, New York, a suburb of Buffalo, as a salesman, but that didn't work out either, so he finally returned to Denver in September of 1941. By this time, Philip Peters had already retired from the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad about 10 years earlier and was about 73 years old. His wife Helen was in the hospital at that time after getting a hip injury, and his children had moved out. Shortly after arriving in Denver, Theodore went to Philip Peters' home to ask for some food and money. He wasn't there, so he let himself inside and eventually found the crawl space upstairs in the closet. He sat and thought for a bit. His lungs were giving him a harder time than usual, which was probably from tuberculosis, and he was severely exhausted emotionally and physically. He couldn't imagine spending another winter on the road, so he decided to make it his home. He ate as much as he could and then went up to his new sleeping chamber, where he slept for several days from exhaustion. When he heard Philip walking around the house, he wouldn't move an inch and practically held his breath in the first couple of weeks. But eventually he became more bold. He knew Philip was hard of hearing and would actually shadow Philip around the house like it was a game. It was the first time in his life that someone was at his mercy, but admits he never wanted to hurt him. He would watch him hiding money throughout the house and considered taking it and leaving, but his cubbyhole was too good to risk abandoning. On October 17th, 1941, Theodore had been living in the home for about 5 weeks. He assumed Philip was not at home and went to take some food out of the icebox. An icebox was basically the precursor to the refrigerator. And that's when he turned and found Philip had found him. Philip apparently hit him with his cane, but who knows who really hit who first. Theodore responded by picking up a revolver that was hanging on the wall and hit him with it, but it broke. As Philip tried to flee the house, Theodore grabbed a stove shaker. So before gas and electric stoves were used, you heated your stove with coal and you would rotate these coals or move them with this stove shaker. It was probably a very heavy iron device. He had hit Philip over 20 times with this, taking out all the years of pent-up anger and frustration out on this poor man. And then he washed it off and went back up to his dark nest. Since Peter's wife was in the hospital, his neighbor and friend Mrs. Jenny Ross offered to make dinner for him nightly. Since Peter was a railway man and always on time, she was concerned since he was late and the food was getting cold. She went outside and mentioned this to a group of other neighbors, so they went over to his home to see what was going on, but they couldn't see inside since the lights were off. They found that all of the doors, windows, and screens were all locked, except for one screen. They removed it and pushed up Mrs. Ross so she could get inside. She stumbled around for a moment around the furniture until she found a light, and she turned it on. It was silent for a few heartbeats until they heard the loud, terrifying scream, followed by 2 others right after. The other people in the neighborhood came out, and then the police came to investigate the scene. There was blood throughout the entire house and signs of a struggle in several rooms. But the police were surprised that there was no money or any valuables taken. It was also weird that everything in the house was locked from the inside besides the one window, which they had gotten in. Although Peters was an older man, he was still a large guy, so they assumed it was another large man that did this. So they were searching the house for the murder weapon and seeing if they could find any clues, and that's when they looked in the closet and looked up at this small rectangular latch in the ceiling. They weren't sure if it went anywhere, but they thought it was probably too small for a person to get through anyway, since it was only about 8 inches by 15 inches. However, they did use the end of their flashlight and hit it against that board several times to see if it would move, but it didn't, and so they left. Theodore was actually sitting on the latch, which is why it didn't move. The police told the crowds to leave, and they monitored the home for some time. Philip's wife, Helen, who was recovering from her hip surgery, naturally didn't return at first. Some neighbors reportedly saw strange things, like when the ghost lights sometimes went on. One neighbor dropped her eggs on the sidewalk when she was certain that she saw a ghastly face of a man behind the windows of the dark house one day. Children in the neighborhood would dare each other to see who could make it to the top of the stairs to the porch at nightfall. Usually only the oldest of the group would be so brave. The local news reported several different stories and headlines about the Denver ghost house slaying, and it would continue to be a big local story if there wasn't more important international news going on. Just a few weeks after the killer ghost struck, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, overshadowing much of the local gossip. It was cold that winter when Helen finally decided to return. Her neighbors thought she was brave and knew she might need some assistance because of her medical condition, so her neighbor hooked up a buzzer from her house to Helen's in case she had any problems. Unfortunately, it wasn't long before her neighbor heard the sound of the buzz one late evening. She went next door and found Helen on the floor. She had somehow become startled from something and fell, re-breaking her thigh. She decided she would stay instead of going to the hospital, so she hired a nurse to take care of her at home. The first woman that came to help was an African American woman named Mrs. Hattie Johnson, who at first wasn't worried about all of the neighborly gossip of this so-called ghost. But it was only a matter of time before Hattie was running across the street to her neighbors to tell them of the things moving in the walls and rattling she heard. The police investigated again, but there was nothing. Helen, who was hard of hearing, figured the neighborhood gossip had gotten the best of Mrs. Johnson. She continued on for a few more days, and then was hysterical after she said she saw a man on the back stairs chattering his teeth at her. Mrs. Edith Clark took her job when she resigned afterwards. It took her only a few days before she heard some mysterious noise coming from the kitchen. She hurried there without turning on the light, where she saw this filthy rat type of creature that quickly disappeared when she screamed. Captain Childers of the Denver police decided to have a day and night watch near the home. Helen, upon the insistence of her relatives, moved in with her grown son in Grand Junction in western Colorado. So Theodore made the best of his tiny space. He found some wires up there that he used for a light bulb and a radio he found. He used a toaster to heat coffee until that ran out. He froze when it was cold, and he nearly suffocated when it was hot, but it was better than living on the streets. Although he had to be more cautious when Helen and Philip or others were at home, it was better because there was more fresh food available. When they were gone, he was mostly living off strawberry jam jars he found in the basement. He would drink water from the sinks, but when that was turned off, he went outside at night to get snow he heated up to melt for water, and he also got some water from the water heater. He would occasionally go downstairs to watch the mailman and others pass by, but it normally made him depressed, so he would go back up to his hole. It was a hot July when two police officers, Roy Bloxham and Bill Jackson, spied on the home through a peek hole across the street. One of them mentioned what a waste of time and taxpayers' money it was to be monitoring a ghost. As the postman came by as he was making his rounds, they grew quiet so they didn't blow their cover. It was just then that one of the police officers noticed a face appear between the curtains across the street. The other cop noticed something as well. They realized they weren't the only ones watching the mailman. They blew their whistles and ran across the street, kicked down the door, and pulled out their guns, not sure how effective they might be against ghosts. They searched the bottom of the house, which was clean, but it smelled like an animal had been hibernating and living there for ages. They ran upstairs as other cops poured into the house, and in the closet, he saw two legs going up into the crawl space. He grabbed at the pant trousers, but they ripped off, and so he grabbed both the legs as hard as he could and dragged the man down to the floor, who ended up passing out from the struggle. The captain told them to call the ambulance for the unconscious man on the floor, who looked like he had been starving for a long time. The cop who found him peered up into the attic and nearly threw up, but was too large to get inside. A smaller policeman, Detective Fred Zarno, volunteered to go up with a handkerchief over his face. He found a bunch of old newspapers and rags on an old ironing board that was his filthy bedding. In the corners of the large coffin were tons of spider webs, and below them were several open glass and tin jars that were full of excrement. He climbed down gagging and said, "A man would have to be a spider to stand it long up there." The newspapers ran with this story, and the legend of the Denver Spiderman was born. Theodore Peters was convicted of first-degree murder in the next year and sentenced to life in the Cannon City Penitentiary. Upon the verdict, he said, "Now I'll feel safe. I'll have a better home than I've had for years." The man who once used his long spidery fingers to play the mandolin now had all the books to choose from leisurely. He was now the prison librarian, and the cell was much larger and comfortable than the attic or streets he once lived. He died on May 16, 1967, at the age of 84. A long life for a man who wasn't supposed to live long enough to finish high school. He was once asked if he liked spiders, and he said yes. Spiders are kinder to me than people. So I've made several videos recently about the JonBenet case, and there are some interesting and similar things about both cases. In the Spider-Man case, the police couldn't even find the perpetrator because they thought the door to the attic was closed and too small to enter, even though the house was locked from the inside. In the JonBenet case, 2 police officers and a family friend couldn't find JonBenet in the wine cellar. They assumed she wouldn't be in there, or they couldn't figure out how to open the door. And in both cases, nothing valuable was taken. In the Spider-Man case, he was a guest at their home previously, and I think it easily could have been the same with the JonBenet case because they had many people at their home over the years. Some people think it would be strange for a kidnapper to stay in the home for several hours at the JonBenet house, but obviously we could see it could be possible since this guy stayed in the home for 10 months. And this kind of thing is actually more common than I realized. This concept of staying in someone's home while they're actually there is called phrogging. And I've seen a few other interesting cases about this, so maybe my next video will be about some interesting stories about phrogging, and then I'll do some other interesting cases about Colorado. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video and this new style I'm trying out. I figured I don't need to be on camera for 10 minutes of a video. I could just put in some AI clips, which are much prettier than my face anyway, even if a lot of these clips are kind of weird. But anyway, let me know what you think about that. And I've got some other cool videos coming up, so subscribe and like it. I'll see you guys next time. And remember to search your house thoroughly before you go to bed.